So the United States turned down an offer by Poland to supply the Ukrainians with old Russian-made fighter jets. Does this mean that we're backing down on our efforts to supply the Ukrainians? Let's talk about it in today's video.
This is not a proxy war by Russia. This is a war by Russia against another country. This is not proxy. This is not them using another country's battlefield and supporting another country. That's proxy, when you're supporting another country. This is direct, and there is no previous model that fits this particular conflict. We did not confront the Russians in Afghanistan. We are doing in Ukraine what we did in Afghanistan. The Russians confronted Afghanistan. We did not dare confront the Russians in Afghanistan.
We're saying the same thing, frankly, because what we're talking about is providing the Ukrainians with the material they need to fight it.
Hi, I'm Mike Greiner. I'm a lifelong Democratic activist who's concerned about the direction our country is taking. I'm also a lawyer and an academic, and I'm here to supply you with the information you need to fight the BS of the MAGA crowd. So you just saw retired Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, one of the few heroes of the Trump presidency, discussing the situation in Ukraine with MSNBC's Lawrence O'Donnell. What's funny is, as I was watching this video, I was thinking to myself, Lawrence O'Donnell is really off base here. We have an exact model of what the United States is trying to do in Ukraine, and that's Afghanistan, back when the United States was supplying the Mujahideen against the Russians. Then, of course, about 30 seconds later, Colonel Vindman says, Afghanistan. Now, I'm not here to toot my own horn. What I am here to do is to point out that we've been here before. Back when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, we engaged in an aggressive effort to undermine them, supplying the Mujahideen for pretty much the entire duration of the Soviet occupation. That occupation became something akin to the American experience in Vietnam for the Soviets, and it resulted in them withdrawing in a humiliating fashion. The entire experience, actually, is documented in the film Charlie Wilson's War, which is a good movie, by the way, and worth a view. But there are a couple lessons that came out of the American support of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. The first one of which is when you engage in these proxy wars, you do it on a covert basis. You don't announce when you're sending certain weapons to the enemy of the other major thermonuclear superpower. You do it under the table, you do it quietly, and in fact, most of the contacts between the United States and the resistance in Afghanistan were done by the CIA, actually. In that way, the United States always had credible deniability to be able to say, oh, we're not really fighting directly against the Soviets. There's no need to escalate this war. Now, what makes these old Soviet-era jets in the possession of the Polish particularly attractive to give to the Ukrainians is the fact that the Ukrainian pilots are already trained in these jets. We have to remember that Ukraine, as part of the former USSR, and Poland, as a former client state of the USSR, basically received the same weapon systems from the Soviets. So it actually makes sense to give them these jets. Even though they're older, they're the kind of jets that the Ukrainian pilots would be very comfortable with. So why doesn't the United States support the transfer of these jets to Ukraine? After all, they seem like they'd be a pretty effective way to counter the Russian bombers, especially in light of the fact that now it's shown that the Russians are basically using dumb bombs, basically randomly bombing residential areas to try to create as much fear as possible among the populace. Well, the truth of the matter is, the United States isn't stopping the Polish from transferring these jets to Ukraine. The United States is objecting to the way that they're trying to do it. You see, what Poland offered to do was to transfer these jets to the United States and then allow us to transfer them to Ukraine. This was publicly announced because the Polish wanted to create pressure on the United States, which they succeeded in quite admirably. The outrage many have expressed over this situation really shows how much we're forgetting both the lessons of Afghanistan as well as the fact that the United States is shipping hundreds of millions of dollars of weapons on an ongoing basis into Ukraine. Many of these weapon systems include the incredibly effective anti-aircraft weapons that we have, such as the Stinger missiles. But what Poland was really trying to do is they were trying to get us to give them modern jets, Essentially, they said, we'll trade you these old Soviet-era jets, which you can then transfer over to the Ukrainians, in exchange for some modern F-16s. And although the F-16s now are probably a generation or two older in terms of the fighter jets that we have here in the United States, on a global scale, they're still an incredibly effective weapon system and highly in demand from our allies. And that's the problem, is we're actually behind schedule in producing these planes. Where is the next set scheduled to go to? Well, they're scheduled to go to Taiwan, which, especially given the current circumstance, you can understand are pretty afraid of what's going on with China. So Poland was basically trying to force our hand to give them some F-16s, which otherwise they'd have to wait for, essentially waiting in line behind Taiwan. This whole situation has become quite an embarrassing and frustrating black eye for the United States, and particularly the Biden administration, who have been really effective in marshaling global support for the Ukrainians. I mean, the response of most people, including me, by the way, when I first saw the report was, why would the United States stand in the way of this transfer? But the bottom line is we're not standing in the way of this transfer. Poland could transfer these planes anytime they want to the Ukrainians. What we're objecting to is, number one, the public way in which it was done, and number two, the fact that they so directly involve the United States because of the fact that what really they're trying to do is get more modern F-16s. So where does this leave the whole situation? Well, Kamala Harris, on her trip through Eastern Europe to reassure our allies, seemed to be dodging questions about any bad feelings between the Polish and the United States. And for their part, the Poles have pretty much indicated that they're over it, that they're fine, that they remain committed to the U.S. efforts to support the Ukrainians, and that they appreciate the United States' continued commitment to the NATO alliance. My guess is, just as we're not seeing how the daily shipment of weapons into Ukraine is occurring, because again, it's being done on a covert basis, because this is a proxy war, as Colonel Vindman pointed out, that these planes will end up being transferred to the Ukrainians, just much more quietly. And perhaps Vice President Harris was able to deliver some promises to the Poles about the fact that maybe we will be transferring some F-16s to them sooner than they might have been getting them otherwise. These transfers will probably involve some third country where, again, the United States will be able to have credible deniability about our involvement in the transfer. But the outrage that some Democrats and all Republicans have been spreading over the administration's response to that offer really are disingenuous because they miss the real issue here. And the real issue is that if we're going to be supplying the Ukrainians in their fight against a nuclear-powered Russian military, we need to do it under the table and quietly, because doing anything other than that is what would be escalatory. Well, if you want to see more about how President Biden has managed this crisis admirably, check out this video over here. I mean, I think there's a great chance that Biden could be viewed as truly a great foreign policy president who managed a crisis very well. I'll see you then. In the meantime, let's hope for continued progress. Thank you.